Animal. Well, it wasn't George the Animal Steel, though.
I don't know. I can't remember. It
Hmm.
was 1991 or so, 1992. So it was a long time ago.
Yeah, that's
And I had a
pretty.
picture of me and the little beaver as well somewhere, but I can't seem to find it. We did Meatballs 3 together.
Yeah, yeah.
He
Now
was in my gang.
you've worked with like amazing like legendary wrestlers, and it kind of just like fell into your lap every time, didn't it?
Oh, yeah. Well, I think it started back in Quest for Fire, which is 1980, and we were all playing cavemen. And so because of the 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 girth that they wanted, they hired all these huge wrestlers from Montreal and from England. And there was the Great Antonio, the Giant Haystacks, Adrian Street, the Mongols, who were under Butch and Danny Lynch. They wrestled under,
Mm.
and these guys were absolute nutsoids. The one guy I asked Danny once, said, "How'd you get so big?" He says, "Steroids and beer." And I asked
That's
him,
great.
he had all these scars on the top of his head.
Mm.
And I said, "Where'd you get those?" He says, "For an extra 5 quid or 50 quid, I slice myself with a razor."
Oh my god.
And he bleeds all over the ring. And then
Yeah.
Adrian Street came up to me and he says, "Whatever you do," he says, "don't mess with these guys because they're crazy. They play practical jokes that put people in the hospital. So don't mess with them."
Oh
And
my
this is
god.
after we're in Africa and they had these little beetles and they were everywhere. And we were eating outside. We were filming in a safari lodge. And of course, it was all open air. So
Hmm.
these beetles were everywhere. And I'm picking them out of my beer and I'm flicking them at Danny with a spoon. And Adrian comes over and goes, "No, no, no, don't do that." He says, "If he even suspects that it was you, you could wake up with like a tarantula in your bed or something like
Oh my
that. So don't."
oh my god. That's fantastic. No, but so you started having these run-ins and these experiences with these wrestlers pretty early on, but you didn't actually get any like crash course in wrestling until Bret Hart and Owen Hart, right?
Yeah, well, there was a little bit during Maniac Mansion, which was 1991 or so, 92.
Hmm.
Uh, but it was more staged and fun as a because it was a real kid show,
Yeah.
and I wasn't wrestling real wrestlers.
Mm.
And then when we did the Honey I Shrunk the Kids, which is about 5 years later,
Yeah.
that's when I got a real crash course in wrestling. Uh, because in the original one, I didn't hit the ground. I won.
Yeah.
Everybody else hit the ground but me.
Yeah, that makes all the
But
difference.
it was the complete reverse when we did Honey I Shrunk the Kids because the only one who hit the ground was me. They played basketball with me, football, you name it. It was because the whole episode was called Wrestling with the Chief,
Hmm.
and I was the next door neighbor, and the chief of police in the town where Peter Scolari, the Honey I Shrunk the Kid's father,
Hmm.
uh, lived. And so the story was that Bret and Owen Hart came over, and we had a little wrestling tussle in the backyard, and I think it was Owen broke his leg in our horsing around. And they were supposed to meet these notorious wrestlers in the ring the next day. They said, "Well, listen, it's your fault. He broke his leg, so you got to go in instead of us." What? And that was the whole gist of the show is these two inexperienced guys would have to go in there. And Peter Scolari, of course, showed up in this giant puffed suit where he couldn't get hurt. He just bounced around. So me, I was there just in wearing a t-shirt and a pair of shorts, and they played ball with me, just bounced me around like nobody's business. I was black and blue for a week.
Oh my god. And that was we talked about this when we met a couple weeks ago, but that was just before Owen had passed away, like just
Yeah,
before.
yeah, it
Yeah.
was just before that. Actually, I've got a picture. Oh, that's Peter and me in the ring with Owen's dad.
Oh yeah, yeah.
There,
Oh, that's
that's better.
awesome. That's so cool. That is so cool. Now, was that your first time? I know it's not your only time, but was that your first time working with Bret Hart?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Well, actually, no, no. The first time was on the Adventures of Sinbad.
Hmm.
We did an episode where we were with Vikings,
Hmm.
and he played a Viking, and he
Oh
was the
wow,
guest on the show, the featured guest. And so
that's
we had a
awesome.
lot of, but it was a whole different style of fighting. There was sword fighting.
Oh wow. Okay.
That was
So
our
you,
forte.
yeah, yeah. So you had to teach him.
Pretty much so, yeah. Because I'd had classical training in saber fighting when I was doing a lot of stage.
Uh-huh.
And the guy that taught us was Patty Crane, who was the fight director at Stratford. And also, back in the old days, he was Errol Flynn's double in Captain Blood.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. So you
And this
were
was the
you.
guy that taught us saber fighting in a play called Zastrozzi, which was a 19th century, it was written recently, but it was about these two rogues in the 19th century that went around sword fighting and defiling women and all that, you know.
Oh wow, wow. So you said this was so you were a stage actor before you were doing like the TV shows and the movies and
Oh,
stuff like
yeah,
that.
yeah.
How did you
I
get started
started
in
in
that?
1971 acting on a stage professionally.
Oh
And I
wow.
just ran into the guy who I apprenticed with at a Comic Con, Robert England.
Oh wow. Get out of
Yeah.
here.
And we hadn't seen each other in 53 years.
Really?
Yeah.
That's crazy to me because you've done your fair share of horror related, projects and movies and things like that, and it just never crossed paths.
No, no, nor did we cross paths at the Comic Cons. And this was the very first time
Wow, where was this one?
in Montreal.
Really? Okay. Wow. So
So that
where
was really
was
a neat thing. You know, I was just writing him a note at the front desk saying, I don't know if you remember me, but I was a young apprentice when you were my mentor at the Great Lakes Shakespeare Festival.
Mhm.
And I turned around and there he was. So we chatted for about 2.5 hours, rehashing and trying to remember people's names. At our age, that takes two.
Yeah. That's so cool. I don't think that's something that we touched on when I had met you at the Nickel City Con, but that's incredible. So, um, when was this con that you guys? Yeah, you said it was in Montreal, but when was
It was
this?
last weekend.
Oh,
I
really?
just got home
Okay.
on Monday. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So that was the one you did after the Nickel City Con.
Yes, the week after.
Oh, fantastic. All right.
And next weekend, I'm going to be in Springfield, Massachusetts.
For another con.
Another one, yeah.
So when we're gonna kind of jump all over the place here because you have such a like storied career, so I know I'm just gonna like bounce all over. But when did you start doing cons?
Uh, about a year and a half before the pandemic. So about
Oh wow.
2018.
Okay.
And
So when you
it
first
was
started doing it.
Cal. It was Cal's Wolverine that got me into it
Oh, okay, okay. So for
because
our
he
fans.
started doing him on his own.
Mhm.
And then we used to run into each other all the time at auditions. And they contacted us for the launch of Eric and Julia Leewald's book previously on X-Men, where they
Mhm.
did this in-depth story of how they got the show on the air,
Mhm.
and they did interviews with each and every one of us. And then to launch the book, they decided that we should all have a reunion. And so we got together at the very first con in New Braunfels, Texas.
Mhm.
And there was only four of us. I think there was Cal, myself, Lenore Zan, and Tony Daniels.
Mhm.
And we were discussing how neat it would be if we resurrected the show. And that was our very first con. And we
Wow.
talked about it, and it was like, oh, wouldn't it be great if now that Marvel has been bought by Disney,
Mhm.
that they'd bring the show back? And he went, ha, 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 yeah, that would be great. And never really gave it another serious thought because it felt like pie in the sky wishfulness, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
And then it happened. And just out
Wow.
of the out of the blue, we got the call. They want to see you guys for rebooting the series.
Wow, that's incredible. Now, do you remember so when X-Men first was coming about, do you remember your process in getting the role of Beast for the
Well, it
voice
was an
actor?
auditioning process. We had to go in and read for the part.
Mm,
And they kept that a secret. They didn't even tell us what show we were reading for because, as in everything, they don't want anything to get out.
right.
And that started with Battlestar Galactica
Mm.
scooping Star Wars.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Okay. So when you,
So
I'm
they
sorry, go
they
ahead.
kept everything a secret after that because it was to who can get the thing on the screen first.
Yeah.
And they
Wow.
started later and got it out sooner. And that was because there was no secrecy back in those days about what
Mm,
you were doing. And then all of a sudden, that was the birth of the NDA and no talking about anything, no scripts until the day you shoot or the day that you record. And they didn't even tell you the title of what you were going in to read for.
so does that make it more difficult for you then because you're reading for a part where you're basically blind to what the story is, to what
Well,
your
they give you a
character looks like?
breakdown of the character and
Ah,
what you're
okay.
supposed to come up with.
Gotcha.
But I was the only one that had the advantage that back in 1963,
Hmm.
when the very first X-Men comic book came out,
Hmm.
I picked it up and read it.
Mm.
And I was an X-Men fan before, so that when they hit me with this Project X, I'm going, Project X, my foot. I said, this is X-Men. So
That's
I knew right
fantastic.
off the bat what I was going in to read for.
Mhm,
And I wanted it bad because that was another one of these opportunities where you get to do something out of your childhood. I
mhm.
mean, what kid didn't imagine that he was a superhero,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
fantasized about all that? And then
right,
to get handed that as an adult in your own career, hey, now you're going to get a chance to play one of them.
right. And
So that
then
was really exciting.
but you also did a cameo in the X Men movie in 2000, right?
Yes, I did. And that was as a result of having done the animated series. It was just the
Okay.
general call to fill these little incidental roles, day player stuff when the Hollywood came to Toronto.
Mhm,
So I got a call to go in and read for a trucker. And it had nothing to do with my having been in X-Men. It was just a general casting call. And I did my 5 lines or whatever it was. And I was ready to leave. And I knew the guy who was the stunt director, and he was sitting right next to Brian Singer.
mhm.
And he leans into him and he says, that's the voice of Beast. And the singer kind of sat up and he called me over to the desk. He says, without your series, I wouldn't be making this movie today. And I
Wow.
got the part of the trucker. And I had a little scene with Anna Paquin, another little scene with Wolverine, Hugh Jackman.
Yeah.
I mean, that was pretty neat as far as I was concerned.
Yeah, no, that's huge. That's huge. So you're doing these cons and everybody's coming to see you, and X Men has made this big comeback, the animated series and all of that. But do you ever get people who, I know for myself, when I saw you, I was like, oh, Christmas Horror Story, because I really love that movie. Do you get a lot of like horror fans that come up and think like, oh, The Brain or Christmas Horror Story?
Oh
Have you seen
yeah,
those?
yeah,
Yeah.
quite a few. And not just that, but people that can find obscure things that I've forgotten about that they'll bring a picture of. I had this guy in Montreal. I did a film with Lorenzo Lamas way back in the 80s
Mhm.
called Snake Eater 2, Drug Buster. And I played some sort of a criminal in it. And he's got a picture of me holding a gun to this guy's head. And I didn't even remember the movie. And I said, where did you find that? And, they come up with obscure things from your past.
Oh
And
wow.
they remember you for that.
It was that like one of the most obscure things you've seen?
That was, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I've had people bring things that surprised me. Uh, Clips from the Brain and things like that. But then the Brain made a big comeback too. That
Yes.
is it become a cult horror film.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, that's personally one of my favorites, along with Christmas Horror Story. So, just a little backstory on how we ended up doing this podcast is I'm sitting across from you at the Nickel City Con, and I didn't even realize we were going to be sitting there, and I looked up, and I was like, no fucking way. It was literally like, you got to be kidding me. And I turned to my buddy and I go, you ever see a Christmas Horror Story? And he was like, yeah. And I just pointed across the way and I was like, I'm going over there.
well, I'm glad you did. I always like talking to people, and you know, I've crossed a lot of genres in my career.
Hmm.
horror, children's stuff, theater,
Yeah.
fantasy, sci-fi, you name it. I mean, in
Well,
Canada, you don't turn anything down. You're lucky to work, and if you love your job, then the more the merrier,
mm.
and the more varied, the more exciting it becomes.
Well, I guess my question then, so since we're just kind of talking about the horror at the moment, is for a Christmas horror story that has become a really like beloved movie in the horror community. Do you get a lot of people like asking you about that specifically? And if so, like, what was that experience like even making that? Because the whole story behind that movie is just mind blowing. The finish, I'm not going to spoil it just in case anybody hasn't seen it, but the ending is a great twist. And the first
Oh,
time
it
you
is.
see it, you're just like, oh my god, like I kind of like sat back the first time I saw that movie and was like, definitely didn't see that coming. And I'm a huge horror fan, so I usually see it coming, you know.
Well, that movie had a lot of different levels to it. I mean, not only
Mhm.
was there that twist at the end, but also that had three different writers and three different directors and
Oh, I
three
didn't realize.
stories that were woven together into one, and it worked. It
Yeah,
really worked
it
because
did.
you had the story of the family and the aunt, and then you had the story of Santa Claus
Hmm.
and Krampus,
Yes.
and then you had a third story in there as well. I can't. My mind is getting old, but there were three stories all woven into one that kind of fed into each other to the climax at the end,
Yeah.
which really is an ingenious thing to do. It's like three short stories
Yes.
that they put together to make a movie.
Yeah, it's for anybody who hasn't seen it. I really urge you if you're listening to this to check it out because it's really not even just like as a holiday horror film, but just as a horror film in general. It's beautifully done. It's wonderfully shot, and
And
it's
I
so
must
much fun.
brag that Rotten Tomatoes gave us an 80% rating.
Did they really?
Yes.
Wow. And they usually aim low.
Oh, I
So
know, really
yeah,
low, below the belt.
yeah, yeah. Right, right. But that's great though,
But that's
and
an 80%. That's like getting an A on your math exam.
right, exactly. And then, to have The Brain under your belt too, which is now a very beloved horror film. And then, but you also had a scene in Diary of the Dead, which,
Yes.
that
And
had to be amazing.
unfortunately, George Romero came up to me and he says, we got to do something together.
Hmm.
And unfortunately, then he passed away.
Oh, wow.
So I never
That's,
got a chance to do anything larger.
yeah. And he's a genius,
Yes, he was.
and
And a very nice man, too.
did you also, I could be wrong on this one, but did you do voice acting for the animated Tales from the Crypt?
Yes.
You did. Okay, so
Yes.
that's a huge, notch in the horror community too. Everybody loves that as well. So you've had your hands in like some of the biggest things that the horror
Yeah.
community loves.
Yeah. I've been very lucky that way that these things have come my way.
And it's just a testament too that people still come up and obviously talk to you about it. Now, one thing I want to touch on that we didn't get to earlier when we were talking about a lot of the people that you got to work with. You also had a run in with Andre the Giant.
Yes.
How was
and
that?
and Little Beaver on the same set. We were doing a beer commercial.
That's great.
A Little Beaver I'd known before because we did Meatballs 3 together. But
Yeah.
Andre the Giant I met for the first time doing the beer commercial.
And how was he?
He got one of the nicest men I've ever met.
Yeah, that's
The only
awesome to
guys
hear.
that ever scared me, as I said, were the Mongols. Those two guys from England
Yeah.
that Adrian warned me about.
So, what in general in your life made you even want to get into acting to begin with? With such a storied career, obviously you're very passionate about it.
Well, I got conned into doing my very first play by my girlfriend back in high
Wow.
school. I went to an all boys school. She went to the all girls school around the corner, and every year they did a senior class play. And they needed guys to audition. And I hadn't even really seen a play up until that point. And I said,
Hmm.
okay, okay, I'll go in. And I auditioned for the part of Mr. Bumble in Oliver. And
Hmm.
I got the part. And I started enjoying myself during the rehearsal process. And on opening night, the minute I walked out on stage and got my first round of applause and my first laugh,
Hmm.
I realized that that's what I wanted to do.
Oh wow.
And I made a point of going around to all the other girls' schools for the rest of the year, auditioning for their plays, just so I could be on stage. And then I decided that was what I was going to major in university,
Oh wow.
and never looked back. I devoured theater courses when I went to BW, Baldwin Wallace in Ohio.
Hmm.
And then I did workshops with Cafe La Mama in New York, and got my equity card, and
Hmm.
never looked back.
Wow. And I want to point out too that a lot of roles that you've played over the years, like, bikers and over again, but you actually are a biker.
Well,
So,
yeah, I've been riding since I was like 15 years old. The guy across the street from me was a salesman for Simon and Schuster, so he was a big shot. He drove a '67 Corvette. Wish I had that now. But anyway, his little brother, was a member of the Galloping Gooses, which is
wow.
one of the very original gangs from post World War II. And he had his Indian chopper parked in Roy's garage. And I was always eyeballing this thing. It's like, wow, this is really a cool machine. Wish I could ride it. And then Roy bought himself a CB 260 Honda. And I was 15 at the time, and he threw me the keys. He says, go take it for a ride. So I had no license. I wasn't even old enough to drive. And I'm out there running around, putting around the little town I lived in on this bike, and fell in love with motorcycles.
Wow. And then
So
it just,
that was one of the things, the reason they could cast me in all these biker roles besides the look was
mhm.
that I could also ride.
So it could, again, another thing that kind of just worked out and fell into your lap because it got you X amount of roles throughout
Oh,
your
yeah.
career.
Yeah. Some great ones, too. And also, I got to do a lot of neat riding. I mean, when we did Sinbad, uh, we were shooting in South Africa. And
Hmm.
one of my bucket list things was to be able to ride in Africa. I did Quest for Fire there in 1980 in Kenya. And I thought, boy, this is country that I would love to ride in. And, we were only there for a few months, and then went back home. And I never got back to Africa for another 16 years.
Oh wow.
So as soon as we started doing Sinbad,
Hmm.
I was in the buy and sells. I'm buying a bike.
Oh, that's great.
And I found this old beat up Goldwing for $1,500.
Hmm.
And the guy who was my stunt double was a biker as well, and he was in a
Hmm.
club.
Hmm.
And so they fixed it up for me, and they got me personalized plates, and I got to ride to work, and I rode across the whole bottom of Africa.
Oh wow.
So that was pretty neat.
That's awesome.
So that's one thing off the bucket list. And then when I did Honey, I Shrunk the Kids,
Hmm.
I took my bike with me, and I got 20,000 miles of riding the Rockies in,
Oh
because
wow.
every day off,
Hmm.
I got up earlier than I'd got up to go to work. And I hopped on the bike and I was gone. And I didn't come
Wow.
back until I had to go back to work. And I
That
rode
is
every road that I could possibly find between Montana, Idaho, British Columbia, and Alberta.
wow.
I rode
What?
the Going to the Sun Road in Glacier National Park in Montana.
Yeah.
That's one of those 19th century feats of engineering where they cut a ledge in the mountainside,
Hmm.
and you're like 10, 12,000 feet going through Glacier National Park. That was just
Wow.
spectacular.
And this was what you said during Honey I Shrunk the Kids. So
That
is
was
that
98 through
98?
2000.
Wow. Wow. That's incredible. Now, so when you get into acting and you're doing the stage stuff and then you get into TV and movies and you're getting like these biker roles and all that. So how do you then transition into the voice acting that you're doing? Because you've done quite a bit of voice acting,
Oh,
actually.
yeah, hundreds and hundreds of things.
Yeah.
Well, there's no real difference. The only difference is you don't have to look your best. It's you and the microphone and the story. And the same way as I did a lot of radio drama as well. And the directors there would teach you it's like watching a movie in your head.
Hmm.
He says, just imagine all the scenes that you're reading and they play out in your head.
Hmm.
And that's the same way you're doing it when you're animating a cartoon.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
The
Now,
story is just playing out in your head. So you're reacting to all this stuff, even though you're doing it solo.
mhm.
You're hearing the voice, the imaginary voice of the line ahead of you that gives you your cue. And it's just like a kid pretending.
Yeah.
You never
Well,
lose that inner child. You always have the ability to pretend.
was it difficult for you to go from, doing the movies that you're doing to then doing like voiceovers for kids shows, or was
Oh,
it just kind of,
absolutely not.
yeah. Oh, okay.
No, I don't find any of this difficult. The only difficulty things that I find is when they make us shoot movies without proper attire and 30 below zero and tell you to stop shivering
Yeah.
or dress you up as Santa Claus when it's 110 degrees.
Oh, yeah,
And
yeah.
could you please stop sweating? That's hard.
Yeah, yeah, no, that I understand. So let's bring it back since we're talking about the animated and the voiceovers to X-Men. Um, when you first signed on for that and you get the role, you get cast as Beast, did you like at any point in time when you first started getting episodes out, did you realize that it was going to be as big as it would become? Like, did you see that coming?
No, no, they never let us know any. I knew that we were a part of something that was fairly important because
Hmm.
X-Men was important to me when I was a kid.
Hmm.
So I didn't think that it was going to be sloughed off or that it was just going to be another cartoon.
Gotcha.
We knew that we were attacking some serious issues in the show, that
Hmm.
it was unlike anything else that was on the air. It wasn't just an action cartoon, it was about something very deep.
Yeah.
And it touched upon a lot of topics that were kind of hot at the time and are even hotter now.
Hmm.
So we knew that we were in something quite unique. And the success of the show was kept a secret from us. They never told us about the tons of mail that was piling up at the studio down in Los Angeles.
Oh, wow.
They always kept us on the hook till the very last minute as to whether we were going to be renewed or not.
Wow. So
But,
now,
we were just glad that we had jobs.
if so it does become this huge sensation, and then obviously it ends up making a comeback, as you said earlier. Would you say that now, with you doing the cons and the comeback and everything, do you think it's bigger now even than it was back then?
Well, I really don't know how big it was back then because all they did was give us descriptions about these, those big mail carts that are the
Mm.
canvas. They look like, the laundry carts
Oh, yeah, yeah.
at a major laundry.
Hmm.
And they were filled with fan mail.
Wow.
But these days, we didn't have the benefit of social media or even digital media at the time.
Yeah.
So we had no idea how big it was. It was whatever people put a stamp on and mailed into Saban
Hmm.
or to Fox.
Yeah.
I mean, now you can track everything.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
So they can give you specifics on how many people are streaming it, how many people are sitting in front of their screens watching it.
Hmm.
That's all monitored now, whereas in our day that really wasn't.
Do you remember back when the show took off, when the action figures and all that stuff started coming out? Did they at least let you in on how popular that stuff was, or did you really not
Nope,
know that either?
nope,
No. Wow.
didn't even give us one.
Really? Wow.
We had to buy our own show jackets.
Oh my god. That's okay. That's kind of funny though, but yeah, I can
I
see
did
why
get a
you
T-shirt.
you did what?
I did get a T-shirt.
Oh. All right, fair enough. Because I remember being a kid and having all of the action figures from X-Men '97 and having the Beasts and the Wolverine and it was like that was the thing to do. Like when that show was on, you were watching it and you had your action figures, and it's kind of almost mind blowing to me that you guys were unaware of how popular you actually were.
Yes, and not on the receiving end of even a toy.
Hmm.
It was all the toys that I have now were given to me by fans.
Oh, wow. Okay. And while you're doing X-Men too, you're still doing other projects. You're not just solely focused on X-Men, correct?
Right now, no, I'm actually a recurring character on Ginny and Georgia for Netflix.
Mm. No, I mean back then
Oh,
when
back
you were
then,
yeah.
yeah. Well, back then I was also a regular on Maniac Mansion. I was
Oh,
playing a
that's when that
mutated
kicked off.
4-year-old kid.
Yeah.
This was for Lucasfilms and it was by the SCTV people.
Hmm.
And Joe Flaherty was my dad.
That's
And
awesome.
he was a mad scientist that had this atomic chamber in his basement. And I was down there playing with my Uncle Harry, and my ball bounced into the atomic chamber. So I ran in after it. And Uncle Harry's going, "No, no, don't go in there." And he ran in after me at the same time that a fly flew in there. And then the door closed and the chamber activated. And when the door opened up, the little kid that had run in there turned into me, this giant, dressed like a 4-year-old. And Uncle Harry turned into a fly.
Oh, that's
And
fantastic.
that was the very first episode. And from that point on, I played this giant 4-year-old kid for 3 years who talked in a falsetto voice and dressed in short pants and overalls. And I would go from the studio filming Maniac Mansion during a break and record X-Men,
Oh, wow.
which was about a 2-mile drive from the studio we were shooting in.
Wow.
Record an episode of X-Men, and then go back to the studio and finish shooting Maniac.
Wow. Well, here's a couple of loaded questions for you. If I had to ask what your favorite role that you've done is, what would you say? Or favorite couple?
Well, the most fun that I ever had on any set was with Peter Scolari on Honey I Shrunk the Kids.
Okay. I could see that.
That was he was such a joy to work with. He was a very generous actor, and the stuff was funny.
Mm.
And I was on the receiving end of all the things that blew up and flying pies and spaghetti in front of an air cannon. I would say about every other show, they put me in front of an air cannon and shot something disgusting at me. And they dressed me up in all kinds of crazy clothes and dressed me up as a woman. They had some fun with me. Not to mention that episode with the wrestlers where I got the crap kicked out of me.
Yes, yeah.
So
And you did. You got a crash course in
I
wrestling
had
for
a crash
bumping and
course in
yeah.
wrestling and how to hit dirt. But that was the most fun. And I would say the most exotic was Sinbad,
Mm.
because I spent 2 years in South Africa.
Yeah. That had to be just a wild
That was
experience in itself.
spectacular.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah,
It was the
yeah,
hardest work I ever did because all the sword fighting that we did there,
yeah.
it would take all day to shoot a scene where
Oh,
we had
wow.
fights because there were 4 of us.
Yeah.
And so they would zero in on each person's individual fight. And then as they were shooting the close-ups for the other people, you had to do it in the background. So you were repeating the same fight for sometimes up to like 10 hours.
Oh, wow.
And the guy that played Sinbad actually practically destroyed his shoulder from
Really?
all the fighting that he had to do.
Now, again, I could be wrong about this too, but originally I had heard back then that Bret Hart was actually supposed to have a reoccurring role on Sinbad, but that fell through for some
Well, he
reason.
was going to play my part.
Oh, you okay?
and
Got it.
he didn't want to get tied down for that long a period.
Okay. Okay,
But he
that
was
makes
their
sense.
first choice for the part of Sinbad's older brother.
Wow.
And he turned it down, and then they came to me.
Wow. Well, that worked out for you.
Oh, it sure did, because I had the time of my life down there.
Yeah. Now, if I had to ask you, maybe this is something you might not want to tell us, but your least favorite roles, is there anything that comes to mind that you were just like, "Ah, I could have done without that one?"
Well, I have done some plays that were real duds,
Mm.
but we learned from them. I mean, there were times where you had performances where there were more people in the audience, fewer people in the audience than there were in the cast.
Mm.
And some of those old clunkers, I could have done without. But again, back then, a job was a job.
Yeah.
And
No, that.
the winter tour of a play in New Brunswick,
Mhm.
that was a not favorite. Uh, we were traveling around in probably the snowiest part of Canada
Mhm.
in the middle of January and February on roads no human being or a car should be on, trying to make our next performance in the little town where we would set up in a gymnasium
Mhm.
and perform this. It was a horror play. It was called "I'll Be Back Before Midnight," and I played the killer.
Oh, wow.
And that was probably one of I'd done the play before, but it was not a tour.
Mhm.
And then when I got the opportunity to do the same role again, I thought, oh, well, I like that role. I'll do it again. And then it turned out to be this winter tour of New Brunswick. It was like, you know,
Uh,
that,
so
that was a downer.
it's funny because those kind of tours exist in wrestling too, up in Canada.
Oh,
They
I
call
know.
them the winter death tours, where they drive over the
Yes.
frozen lakes and all that. So
Oh, I know. I know. We were probably right behind your bus.
no, you're not originally from Canada though, right?
No, originally I'm from Cleveland.
Okay, so you relocated to Canada and then you've been there ever since.
Yeah. Yeah. They brought
Okay.
me up here to do a play,
Hmm.
and I kept getting offered work.
Hmm.
So I went and applied for permanent residency, and I had to go back to the States for 3 or 4 months until they processed the application. And then I went through the interview process in Detroit and got accepted as a landed immigrant, and never stopped working since I came up here.
Clearly, you haven't stopped working because you even just said a minute ago that you have a reoccurring role for a Netflix show right now.
Yeah.
So,
And I thought I retired.
well, I mean, so staying on, just the topic of still working, I want to, before I get you out of here, I want to plug any cons that you have coming up. And if there's anything else that you want to plug or anything else that's coming up that you can tell us about, feel free to do that now and let everybody know where they can keep up with what you're doing if you have like a website or social
No,
media.
I don't do much of that stuff at all. As far as I go, and that is doing the Zoom or StreamYard uh, interviews.
Hmm.
But I don't have anything on social media. I've never gotten into that.
Hmm.
Kids do that for me. Sometimes they'll put stuff on that I'm doing on theirs.
Yeah.
But the next con I've got coming up is this weekend coming in Springfield, Massachusetts.
Hmm.
And then I've got one in Roanoke, Virginia. Let me see if I got the list here. Yeah, the next one is August 3rd and the 4th in Virginia, in Roanoke. And then in September, the 27th through the 29th, I'm doing the Uncanny Experience in Minneapolis, which is this old mansion in downtown Minneapolis that they've converted to the Xavier School for Gifted Children.
Oh, wow.
And so the lady playing Storm and myself, Allison Seeley Smith, will be going to that one
Wow, that's
because we
awesome.
missed out last year. We didn't go. Some of the other cast members went.
Okay. That's really cool.
And then
Well,
I think we're in Cincinnati as well. The next one will be the end of October, October 18th to the 20th in Cincinnati.
what is that? That's not a horror hound weekend, is it?
No, no, these are all just Comic Cons.
These are just Comic
None
Cons.
of
Okay.
these are horror.
Okay. Okay. So I got to ask then before I let you go. This will be my last question. As far as X-Men, obviously we know that that's the big one. What's the runner up to X-Men that most people come up and talk to you about?
Christmas Horror Story.
Yeah. I thought so.
Except in Montreal, I had more fans of Sinbad than I did of anything else. And
Oh,
it
wow.
turns out it's because Sinbad was like on a continuous loop in Quebec
Oh, wow.
when it was running, and it became enormously popular.
Really?
So I had all these fans. I actually ran out of pictures for Sinbad,
Wow.
or not, yeah, for Sinbad because of the popularity of it in Quebec. And in Quebec, we were all dubbed
Oh,
because it's in
wow.
French.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, Sinbad was like it was a big deal. It was a big show. Like I remember it being a big show. So I mean,
Well, it
again,
was right along with Hercules and Xena.
exactly. And I loved those too. That was right in my wheelhouse at that time in my life. So again, were you aware of the success of Sinbad as it was
Oh, yeah,
happening?
we knew about that. They told us we were already sold in 56 countries.
Oh, wow.
And we were shooting for syndication,
Hmm.
which would have been at least a minimum of 3 seasons. And God bless him, the producer from the American interest kind of blew it for us because we got some new partners in from Germany,
Hmm.
and they were going to invest a whole mess of money to pull us through a third season.
Hmm.
And then along with the Canadian partners. And then the American partner went in there and basically said, all right, I'm going to tell you how we're going to do things. And the Germans pulled out. and the show folded.
Oh wow, wow, that's a shame. And that
Yes,
again,
it was.
and it's a
Because I
shame.
had to go
It's
back and sell my bike.
yeah, that's the worst part.
That was the worst. I was looking for another year of putting around the Cape. I had
I'll tell you,
trips planned.
I'm sure you did, and I'll tell you what, that show, if you watch it now, for anybody who hasn't, you can still watch it. It still holds up. It's a great show.
Well, it was like the old Harry Harryhausen films from the 1950s and the early 60s, which is what my grandfather took me to see. So again, when I got to do Sinbad, this was another one of those fantasies from my childhood
Mhm.
that came true. Because he used to take me to see all those fantasy movies from the late 50s and the early 60s.
Yeah.
And I used to watch all the old horror movies at his house. The Attack of the Crab Monsters, The
Oh yeah,
Thing, The Blob,
yeah, the classics. Yeah,
the classics.
absolutely,
Saturday Night.
and they still hold up too.
Oh
Great,
yeah, I still
great
love them.
movies. Yeah. Well, George, I gotta say, man, this has been awesome, and I thank you so much for agreeing to do this. And it was great to meet you at the Nickel City
Yeah,
Con.
I hope we
And
run into each other again.
yeah, same, same. I will
And this has
definitely
been
be
a lot
sure.
of fun. Thank you very much for having me on.
Absolutely, I'll be sure to let you know if I'm going to be anywhere that you are, so we can link up again.
Cool. Great talking to you.
You
All the
too.
best.